Close your eyes and imagine walking through the streets of Rome at the height of its power. The year is 117 AD, and you're witnessing the most magnificent city the world has ever seen. Towering marble columns pierce the sky like frozen lightning. Bronze statues of emperors and gods line every street, so lifelike they seem to breathe. Mosaics depicting epic battles cover the floors beneath your feet with millions of tiny colored stones, each one placed by hand with mathematical precision. But here's what will send chills down your spine. Scattered throughout this marble paradise are artifacts from a dying world. Greek statues, their perfect faces now serving Roman masters. Egyptian obelisks, torn from their homeland and planted in Roman soil like trophies of conquest. The artistic treasures of entire civilizations, looted and displayed as symbols of Roman dominance. You're witnessing the greatest art heist in human history. But what you're about to discover tonight will shock you even more. Rome didn't just steal the art of other civilizations. They perfected a form of artistic propaganda so powerful it would control human minds for centuries. They created images. Let me take you back to the moment when Rome's artistic destiny was sealed forever. The year is 146 BC. And General Lucius Mummius stands amid the smoking ruins of Corinth, one of Greece's most beautiful cities. His soldiers have just completed one of the most systematic art thefts in human history. Mummius wasn't just a conqueror. He was Rome's first official art collector. As he walked through Corinth's ransacked temples and galleries, he made a decision that would define Roman culture for the next 600 years. Every sculpture, every painting, every precious artwork would be shipped to Rome. Greece's artistic treasures would become Rome's imperial decorations. But this wasn't random looting. This was calculated cultural conquest. The Romans understood something that no previous empire had grasped: that controlling art meant controlling hearts and minds. When they displayed stolen Greek statues in Roman forums, they weren't just showing off their wealth. They were demonstrating that Rome had inherited the cultural authority of Greece, that Roman power was blessed by the same gods who had inspired Greek artists. Picture the psychological impact on ordinary Romans seeing these masterpieces for the first time. Greek sculptors had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had made marble look like living flesh. The Doryphoros, Polykleitos' sculpture of the perfect male athlete, was so anatomically precise that Roman doctors used it to study human musculature. The Venus de Milo-made stone seemed to breathe and pulse with life. To Romans who had never seen such artistic mastery, these sculptures must have seemed like actual gods frozen in marble. No wonder they began worshipping them. But Mummius made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that possessing Greek art would automatically give Romans Greek artistic ability. He was wrong. Rome could steal Greece's masterpieces, but they couldn't steal the centuries of artistic tradition and knowledge that had created them. This created a bizarre cultural situation. Rome became the art capital of the world while remaining artistically dependent on Greece. Wealthy Romans competed to own Greek originals, driving prices so high that an entire industry of Greek forgers emerged to create ancient masterpieces for gullible collectors. The real Greek artists, meanwhile, became essentially artistic slaves, forced to create Roman-themed works in Greek styles. Imagine the psychological impact on artists, whose cultural heritage was being systematically erased and repackaged for their conqueror's glory. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Some of those enslaved Greek artists began embedding secret messages in their Roman commissions, hidden symbols of resistance, subtle mockeries of Roman power, artistic time bombs that wouldn't be decoded for centuries. The most famous example is the Era Passus, Augustus's grand altar celebrating Roman peace. The Greek artists who carved it included barely visible details that actually tell a very different story. Figures with expressions of hidden sorrow, symbolic elements that reference Greek independence, compositional choices that subtly undermine the Roman narrative. These artists were playing a dangerous game, but they understood something crucial. Art has the power to preserve truth, even when truth itself is forbidden. They were creating artistic time capsules that would preserve the Greek spirit for future generations to discover. But if you think Roman art theft was shocking, wait until you hear about what happened when Roman emperors discovered they could commission art to reshape reality itself. Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, built a palace called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, that covered 1/3 of Rome's city centre. But this wasn't just architecture. This was artistic megalomania on a scale never seen before or since. Picture this: a palace with over 300 rooms, every single surface covered in frescoes painted by the greatest artists in the empire, walls that moved and changed color depending on the viewing angle, ceilings that rotated to mirror the movement of the stars, dining rooms with ivory panels that could be shifted to rain flower petals and perfume on guests. The centerpiece was a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of Nero himself, depicted as the sun god's soul. This colossus was so massive that it could be seen from miles away, dominating Rome's skyline like a divine presence watching over the city. But Nero's artistic vision was darker than mere vanity. He commissioned artists to create an entire alternate reality where he was literally worshipped as a god. Every painting, every sculpture, every decorative element reinforced the message that Nero wasn't just an emperor. He was divine. The most disturbing part was how effective this artistic propaganda became. Contemporary accounts describe Romans who genuinely believed they were in the presence of a god when they entered Nero's palace. The art was so overwhelming, so carefully designed to inspire awe and submission, that it actually convinced people to abandon their rational judgment. But Nero's artistic empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The more he used art to claim divinity, the more he separated himself from human reality. The paintings and sculptures that were meant to immortalize him instead documented his descent into madness. When Nero finally died by suicide in 68 AD, Romans systematically destroyed his artistic legacy. The Golden House was buried beneath new construction. The colossal statue was melted down for bronze. Frescoes were painted over or deliberately damaged. But some survived, hidden beneath centuries of dirt and rubble. When Renaissance artists rediscovered fragments of Nero's palace in the 15th century, they were so amazed by the artistic techniques, They found that they literally crawled through underground tunnels with torches to study the ancient frescoes by candlelight. These artists, including Raphael and Michelangelo, had stumbled upon Rome's artistic nuclear weapons, propaganda techniques, so sophisticated they had convinced an entire empire that a mortal man was a god. The Renaissance masters studied these techniques obsessively, learning to create their own reality-bending masterpieces from the fragments of Nero's buried dreams. The irony is perfect. Nero's attempt to achieve immortality through art failed completely, but his artistic techniques lived on to inspire some of the greatest masterpieces in human history. But the most haunting Roman artwork wasn't created during the empire's golden age. It was painted as Rome was dying, by an artist who knew he was documenting the end of the world. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted with such violence that it buried entire cities in ash and pumice. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, they found something miraculous: a perfectly preserved Roman city, frozen at the moment of destruction. That hidden in a villa in nearby Herculaneum, they discovered something even more extraordinary: the last great masterpiece of pagan art. The Villa of Papyri contained a painting that took investigators decades to fully understand. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical Roman mythological scene: gods and goddesses arranged in classical poses. But as they studied it more carefully, they realized they were looking at something unprecedented. This wasn't just a painting, it was a visual encyclopedia of pagan knowledge, created by an artist who understood that the old world was ending and wanted to preserve its wisdom for the future. Every figure in the composition represents a different aspect of ancient spiritual knowledge. The positioning of the gods follows astronomical alignments that were sacred to mystery religions. The colors used correspond to alchemical formulas that were closely guarded secrets. The mathematical proportions encode geometric principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. But the most remarkable element is hidden in plain sight. The central figure, initially identified as Jupiter, is actually a portrait of the unknown artist himself, depicted as achieving divine status through the act of creation. This was the artist's ultimate statement: that creativity itself was divine, that the act of making art was a form of communion with the gods. The painting was completed just weeks before Vesuvius erupted. Ash from the volcano sealed the villa, preserving this artistic testament for nearly 2,000 years. When it was finally uncovered, researchers realized they were looking at a time capsule deliberately created to preserve pagan artistic knowledge through whatever catastrophe the artist sensed was coming. But here's the chilling part: the artist was right. Within a few centuries of this painting's creation, the knowledge it preserved would be systematically destroyed by the rise of Christianity. The mystery religions it referenced would be banned. The artistic techniques it demonstrated would be forgotten. This single painting became the last repository of artistic and spiritual knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years. It's simultaneously a masterpiece and a tombstone, marking the death of the classical world while preserving its essence for future rediscovery. When Renaissance humanists finally decoded the painting's hidden meanings in the 15th century, they wept. They realized they had found a message in a bottle thrown across 1,500 years of darkness by an artist who had foreseen the collapse of his entire civilization. Now let me take you to witness the single most important moment in the history of Western art. A moment that happened not in an artist's studio, but in a Roman palace where one man's spiritual vision would transform art forever. The year is 312 AD. Emperor Constantine stands on the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, preparing for the battle that will determine the fate of the empire. According to legend, he looks up at the sky and sees something impossible. A cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer," written across the heavens. Whether Constantine actually experienced this vision or fabricated it for political purposes, his decision to embrace Christianity would trigger an artistic revolution more dramatic than anything that had come before. But here's what most people don't understand about this moment. Constantine didn't just legalize Christianity, he weaponized it. And his primary weapon was art. Within months of his conversion, Constantine began commissioning Christian artworks designed to completely replace the visual culture of the pagan world. But these weren't the gentle, spiritual images we associate with early Christianity. These were artistic nuclear weapons designed to obliterate 1,000 years of classical artistic tradition and replace it with something entirely new. The challenge was enormous. How do you create art for a religion that had spent 300 years rejecting artistic representation? How do you visualize a God who is supposed to be invisible and infinite? How do you make the abstract concepts of Christian theology into compelling visual narratives? Constantine's solution was brilliant and ruthless. He hired the greatest artists in the empire, many of them still secretly pagan, and forced them to reinvent their entire artistic vocabulary virtually overnight. The results were unprecedented. Artists who had spent their careers perfecting the representation of classical gods and heroes suddenly had to learn to paint martyrs, miracles, and mystical visions. Sculptors who had mastered the idealized human form had to figure out how to carve angels, demons, and divine apparitions. But the most radical change was philosophical. Classical art had celebrated human achievement, physical beauty, and earthly power. Christian art demanded the opposite: the glorification of suffering, the rejection of worldly pleasure, the promise of rewards in an invisible afterlife. This wasn't just a change in subject matter. It was a complete inversion of artistic values that would reshape human consciousness for the next 1,000 years. The transition wasn't smooth. Many artists struggled to abandon techniques and principles they had spent lifetimes mastering. Some secretly continued creating pagan works while publicly producing Christian commissions. Others experienced genuine spiritual conversions that transformed their artistic vision. But the most tragic casualties were the artworks themselves. Constantine ordered the systematic destruction of pagan temples and their artistic treasures. Sculptures that had taken lifetimes to create were smashed with hammers. Paintings that had inspired generations were painted over with Christian imagery. Entire artistic traditions vanished overnight. What we're witnessing isn't just the rise of Christian art. It's the controlled demolition of the classical artistic world and its replacement with something unprecedented in human history. But as the Roman Empire crumbled and Europe descended into what historians call the Dark Ages, something extraordinary happened to art. It didn't disappear. It went underground, literally and figuratively, where it would undergo the most profound transformation in human history. Picture this. It's 543 AD, and you're following a hooded monk down a narrow stone corridor deep beneath a monastery in Ireland. The world above is chaos. Barbarian armies sweep across Europe. Cities burn. Knowledge accumulated over centuries disappears overnight. But down here, in the quiet darkness, something miraculous is happening. Brother Columbus sits hunched over a manuscript, his face illuminated by a single candle. And he's not just copying text. He's creating art so intricate, so breathtakingly beautiful, that it rivals anything produced in the greatest classical workshops. Every letter is a tiny masterpiece. Every margin blooms with creatures so fantastical, they seem to have been plucked from dreams. This is the birth of illuminated manuscripts, books that are also artworks where every page becomes a window into the divine. But here's the revolutionary part. These artists chose anonymity. After centuries of Roman artists competing for imperial favor and personal glory, the medieval artists deliberately erased their individual identities. They signed their works only with phrases like, "Remember the sinner who made this," or "Pray for the unworthy artist." This wasn't humility, it was spiritual strategy. By abandoning personal ego, these artists believed they could become pure channels for divine inspiration. They developed techniques for entering trance states while working, allowing what they believed was the hand of God to guide their brushes and pens. The results were unprecedented. Art that seemed to glow with inner light. Images that appeared to move and change as viewers watched them. Decorative patterns so complex and mathematically perfect that modern computers struggle to replicate them. The Book of Kells, created around 800 AD in an Irish monastery, contains over 2,000 individual illustrations, each one different, each one impossibly intricate. A single page might contain 158 separate animals, woven together in patterns so complex that scholars are still discovering new details after centuries of study. But these weren't just pretty pictures. Each illuminated manuscript was a spiritual technology designed to transform consciousness. The act of looking at these images was considered a form of prayer, a way of communing directly with the divine through visual meditation. The monks developed color formulations that created psychological effects. Certain blues induced feelings of transcendence. Specific reds triggered emotional responses associated with divine love. Gold leaf was applied in patterns that caught candlelight in ways designed to create the illusion of divine illumination. Working on these manuscripts could take decades. Some monks spent their entire adult lives on single books, developing relationships with their artworks that bordered on the mystical. They would speak to their images, pray with them, sometimes claim to receive visions or guidance from the figures they were painting. This was art as spiritual practice, creation as communion with the infinite. But while monks created their mystical manuscripts in hidden scriptoriums, another group of anonymous artists was developing artistic techniques, so advanced they still baffle modern engineers. The cathedral builders. Between 1050 and 1350 AD, Europe exploded with cathedral construction unlike anything seen before or since. But these weren't just buildings. They were massive artistic collaborations involving hundreds of craftspeople. working across generations to create unified visions of heavenly beauty. Let me take you inside the mind of Master Robert, a stone carver working on Notre Dame de Paris in 1220. He's been working on cathedrals for 30 years, following his father and grandfather in the same profession. But Robert possesses knowledge that seems almost supernatural. He can look at a rough block of limestone and see the angel hidden inside, and carve it free with such precision that modern sculptors study his techniques. He understands how light will fall on his carved figures at different times of day and seasons, creating sculptures that seem to change expression as shadows shift. But Robert's knowledge goes far beyond artistic technique. He's part of a secret brotherhood of stonemasons, who guard mathematical and geometric secrets passed down through generations. They know the precise proportions that create feelings of transcendence in viewers. They understand acoustic principles that make cathedrals perfect sound chambers. They've mastered engineering techniques that allow them to build structures that seem to defy gravity. These weren't just craftsmen. They were the inheritors of ancient wisdom, traditions that stretched back to the pyramid builders of Egypt and the temple architects of Greece. The guild system that governed cathedral construction was essentially a secret society. Master craftsmen guarded their knowledge jealously, passing it only to carefully chosen apprentices who proved their worthiness through years of service. They developed coded symbols and architectural signatures that only other guild members could recognize. But here's what's truly mysterious about these cathedral builders. They possessed knowledge that officially didn't exist in medieval Europe. Their mathematical understanding was centuries ahead of contemporary scholarship. Their engineering techniques surpassed anything documented in surviving texts. Their artistic vision synthesized influences from across the known world in ways that suggest access to information networks that historians haven't yet mapped. Some researchers believe the cathedral builders were the inheritors of Roman engineering knowledge that survived the collapse of the empire through secret traditions. Others propose that they had contact with Islamic scholars who had preserved and advanced classical learning during Europe's Dark Ages. But the most intriguing theory suggests that these master builders were connected to the Templars and other mystical orders that claimed to possess ancient wisdom from sources as diverse as Byzantine monasteries and Islamic libraries. Whatever the source of their knowledge, these anonymous masters created architectural artworks so sophisticated that modern engineers struggle to understand their construction methods. They built structures that have survived wars, earthquakes, and centuries of weathering while maintaining their perfect proportions and acoustic properties. Most remarkably, they designed their cathedrals as total artistic experiences. Every element, from the massive rose windows that paint rainbows across stone floors to the tiniest carved details on hidden capitals, was calculated to create specific emotional and spiritual effects on visitors. Walking into a Gothic cathedral was like entering a carefully orchestrated piece of performance art, designed to overwhelm the senses and lift consciousness toward the divine. But hidden within the male-dominated world of medieval art was a revolution being led by women, whose names were largely erased from history, but whose artistic innovations would influence centuries of art that followed. In convents across Europe, nuns were developing artistic techniques that were in many ways more advanced than anything being produced in male monasteries or secular workshops. Working in complete isolation from the artistic trends of their time, These women created a unique visual language that combined mystical vision with technical mastery. Let me introduce you to Sister Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess who experienced visions so vivid and complex that she spent decades trying to translate them into visual form. But Hildegard wasn't just documenting her visions. She was inventing new artistic techniques to make the invisible visible. Her illuminated manuscripts contain images unlike anything else in medieval art. Cosmic diagrams that show the structure of the universe as revealed in her visions. Botanical illustrations that are both scientifically accurate and spiritually symbolic. Human figures surrounded by flames of light that seem to pulse and move on the page. But here's what makes Hildegard's work truly revolutionary. She developed color formulations and application techniques that created optical effects, centuries before they were formally understood. Her gold leaf application catches light in ways that make her figures seem to glow from within. Her blues create depth and dimensionality that rivals Renaissance perspective techniques. Hildegard claimed that her artistic techniques were directly revealed to her during mystical experiences. She described receiving detailed instructions about color mixing, compositional principles, and even specific brush movements during her visions. Whether divinely inspired or the result of extraordinary artistic intuition, her innovations were centuries ahead of their time. But Hildegard was just one of hundreds of female artists working in medieval convents. These women had advantages that secular artists lacked: unlimited time to perfect their techniques, access to the finest materials through church wealth, and most importantly, freedom from the commercial pressures that constrained male artists. Convent scriptoriums became laboratories where women could experiment freely with artistic techniques. They developed new approaches to manuscript decoration that emphasized emotional and spiritual content over mere technical display. They created color palettes that emphasized psychological effect over realistic representation. Most remarkably, they established artistic traditions that were passed exclusively from woman to woman across generations. Mother superiors would identify young nuns with artistic potential and provide them with training that was in many ways more comprehensive than anything available in secular workshops. These women understood that their art served a different purpose than male religious art. While monks often painted to glorify church hierarchy and doctrine, nuns painted to facilitate direct spiritual experience. Their images were designed to induce mystical states, to serve as visual prayers, to create bridges between earthly consciousness and divine reality. The artistic techniques they developed, the use of pure color to create emotional effects, the integration of text and image into unified experiences, the creation of contemplative spaces through visual design would eventually influence everything from stained glass, windows to modern abstract painting. But perhaps most importantly, these anonymous women preserved artistic knowledge and techniques through Europe's darkest periods. When secular art traditions were being lost to war and chaos, the convents maintained unbroken chains of artistic transmission that would prove crucial to Europe's artistic renaissance. While Western Europe struggled through its dark ages, something extraordinary was happening in the East. In Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, artists were developing a form of visual art so powerful it would influence human consciousness for over 1,000 years. that this revolution began with what seemed like artistic suicide. In 726 AD, Byzantine Emperor Leo III issued the iconoclastic decree, an order that banned religious images throughout the empire. Overnight, centuries of accumulated artistic tradition became illegal. Artists were forced to destroy their own masterpieces or face execution. Picture the scene. In workshops across the Byzantine Empire, painters watched their life's work burn. Sculptors smashed statues they had spent years carving. Mosaic artists chiseled precious stones from church walls, destroying images that had taken decades to complete. But some artists refused to comply. They went underground, literally hiding in caves and abandoned buildings to continue their forbidden work. They developed new techniques that could be quickly concealed or disguised if authorities appeared. They created portable artworks that could be hidden or smuggled to safety. Most importantly, they began experimenting with abstract and symbolic approaches that could convey spiritual meaning without depicting recognizable human or divine figures. When the iconoclastic period finally ended in 843 AD, these underground artists emerged with artistic techniques that were completely different from anything that had existed before. They had learned to paint light itself, not the representation of light, but pure luminosity that seemed to emanate from within their images. The secret was in their understanding of gold. Byzantine artists developed application techniques that made gold leaf seem to glow from within, rather than simply reflect external light. They learned to create multiple layers of transparency that gave their images an otherworldly depth and brilliance. But the real revolution was psychological. The iconoclastic period had forced artists to abandon realistic representation and focus instead on creating images that would induce specific spiritual states in viewers. They developed a visual language based on pure color, geometric proportion, and symbolic content rather than literal description. The result was Byzantine icons, paintings that were designed not to be looked at, but to be experienced. These images were believed to be windows into the divine realm, actual points of contact between earthly and heavenly consciousness. The technique was so effective that people literally worshipped these paintings. They would spend hours gazing into icon paintings, claiming to receive visions, healing, and divine guidance from the images. The paintings became focal points for intense spiritual experiences that bordered on the psychedelic. But here's what's truly remarkable about Byzantine icons. They worked. Modern research into the psychology of meditation and consciousness has confirmed that the specific color combinations, geometric proportions, and compositional techniques used in icon painting do indeed induce altered states of consciousness. The Byzantine artists had essentially created visual drugs, images that could reliably trigger transcendent experiences without any external chemical assistance. But if you want to witness the absolute pinnacle of Byzantine artistic achievement, you need to journey to Ravenna, Italy, where artists created something that still leaves visitors speechless 1,500 years later. In the 6th century, Ravenna became the capital of the Byzantine Empire's western territories. Emperor Justinian commissioned a series of churches decorated with mosaics that would demonstrate Byzantine artistic supremacy to the still pagan populations of Italy. That what those artists created transcended politics and propaganda. They achieved something that seems impossible. They made light solid. Picture yourself entering the Basilica of San Vitale on a bright morning. The moment you step inside, you're surrounded by walls that seem to be made of captured sunlight. Every surface is covered with millions of tiny glass and gold tesserae, individual pieces of mosaic that catch and reflect light in ways that make the entire building seem to pulse with divine energy. But this isn't just pretty decoration. These mosaics were designed using optical principles that wouldn't be formally understood for centuries. The artists knew exactly how to angle each tiny piece of glass to create specific lighting effects. They understood how different colors would interact when placed in proximity, how gold would enhance certain hues while neutralizing others. The famous mosaic of Emperor Justinian and his court demonstrates technical mastery that borders on the supernatural. Each figure is composed of thousands of individual tesserae, but the overall effect is so seamless that the figures seem to exist in three-dimensional space, rather than on flat walls. But here's what gives this mosaic its hypnotic power. The artists used a technique that had never been attempted before. They varied the size and angle of tesserae to create the illusion that the figures are actually emerging from the wall toward the viewer. Justinian appears to be stepping out of the mosaic into real space. The psychological effect is overwhelming. Visitors often report feeling that they're in the presence of their actual historical figures, rather than looking at representations of them. The mosaics create such a powerful illusion of reality that they seem to collapse the boundary between art and life. Even more remarkably, the Ravenna artists achieved perfect acoustic integration with their visual art. The mosaic patterns were designed to enhance the church's natural acoustics, creating sound environments that made singing seem to come from the images themselves. When Byzantine choirs performed in these spaces, the combination of visual splendor and acoustic perfection created experiences that convinced many visitors they were witnessing actual divine manifestations. The art didn't just depict the divine, it seemed to make the divine present and accessible. But the most mysterious aspect of the Ravenna mosaics is their mathematical precision. Recent computer analysis has revealed that the spacing and proportions of tesserae follow complex geometric patterns that create subliminal effects on viewers. The patterns induce eye movements that mirror meditative practices, helping viewers enter contemplative states without conscious effort. These artists were using advanced knowledge of human psychology and perception to create artworks that functioned as spiritual technologies. They had discovered how to use visual art to directly influence human consciousness in ways that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. But just as Byzantine art reached its pinnacle of achievement, catastrophe struck. In 541 AD, a plague more devastating than the Black Death swept through the Mediterranean world, killing up to half the population and triggering an artistic dark age that would last for centuries. The plague of Justinian didn't just kill people, it destroyed entire artistic traditions. Workshops that had operated for generations closed overnight. Master craftsmen died before they could pass their knowledge to apprentices. Techniques that had taken centuries to develop vanished in a matter of months. But in this destruction, something unexpected happened. The artists who survived were forced to completely reimagine their craft. brother Marcus was a young mosaic artist working in Constantinople when the plague struck. In 6 months, he watched his master, his fellow apprentices, and most of his family die. The great workshop where he had trained became a tomb. The sophisticated techniques he had spent years learning became useless because there was no one left who understood them. Alone in the ruins of Byzantine civilization, Marcus faced a choice: abandon art entirely or reinvent it from nothing. He chose to reinvent. Working in complete isolation, using whatever materials he could scavenge from abandoned workshops, Marcus began developing artistic techniques that were completely different from anything that had come before. Without access to the complex guild systems and formal training methods of the past, he was forced to rely purely on intuition and spiritual guidance. The art he created was raw, emotional, immediate in ways that Byzantine court art had never been. Instead of the polished perfection of imperial mosaics, Marcus created images that seemed to bleed genuine human emotion. His saints didn't just represent suffering, they embodied it. His angels didn't just symbolize divine joy, they radiated it. Word of Marcus's revolutionary approach spread through the decimated artistic community of Constantinople. Other surviving artists began abandoning classical techniques in favor of this new, emotionally direct style. They developed methods for working quickly with limited materials, creating maximum emotional impact with minimum resources. But most importantly, they abandoned the hierarchical workshop system that had dominated art production for centuries. Instead of master craftsmen controlling apprentices, the plague survivors formed collaborative communities, where knowledge was shared freely and artistic decisions were made collectively. This collaborative approach led to artistic innovations that would have been impossible under the old system. Different artists would work on the same pieces, with painters, mosaic artists, and metalworkers contributing their expertise to unified projects. The results were artworks that synthesized multiple traditions and techniques in unprecedented ways. The plague had inadvertently created the conditions for an artistic renaissance that emphasized emotional authenticity over technical perfection, spiritual content over political propaganda, and collaborative creation over individual genius. These innovations would eventually spread throughout Europe, carried by surviving artists who traveled from court to court, monastery to monastery, sharing their hard-won knowledge with local communities desperate for any connection to artistic tradition. But while the Mediterranean world struggled to rebuild its artistic traditions after the plague, something completely unexpected was happening in the frozen fjords of Scandinavia. Viking warriors, supposedly the barbarians who were destroying European civilization, were creating art so sophisticated and original that it would influence European design for centuries. This challenges everything we think we know about the Dark Ages. Picture this. It's 856 AD. And you're sailing up a Norwegian fjord with Ericsson the Bold, a Viking chieftain returning from a raid in Ireland. His longship's dragonhead prow cuts through icy waters, but hidden beneath rough furs and battle gear, Ericsson carries treasures more precious than gold, illuminated manuscripts stolen from Irish monasteries. But Ericsson isn't just a looter. He's an artist. That night, as his crew celebrates their successful raid, Ericsson sits alone in his hall, studying the intricate knotwork patterns in the stolen manuscripts by firelight. His calloused warrior's hands trace the flowing lines with surprising gentleness. He's trying to understand the mathematical principles behind these impossibly complex decorative patterns. Within weeks, those stolen Irish designs begin appearing on Viking metalwork, wood carvings, and stone sculptures, but transformed by a distinctly Norse artistic sensibility that valued power, movement, and raw emotional force over the contemplative spirituality of Christian art. The Vikings created an artistic fusion that shouldn't have been possible. They combined the sophisticated geometric patterns of Celtic, Christian art with their own shamanic traditions of animal transformation and spiritual journey narratives. They synthesized the technical mastery of Mediterranean craftsmanship with the wild, untamed energy of Northern European paganism. The results were artworks unlike anything the world had ever seen. Ship burials filled with treasures that combined Christian symbolism with pagan mythology. Memorial stones that told epic stories through interwoven images of gods, heroes, and monsters. Metalwork so intricate that modern jewelers struggle to replicate the techniques. But the most revolutionary aspect of Viking art was its democratization of artistic creation. Unlike the hierarchical systems of medieval Europe, Viking society encouraged artistic expression across all social classes. Ordinary farmers carved elaborate decorations on everyday objects. Warriors created personal artistic signatures that they incorporated into their weapons and armor. Every Viking was expected to be capable of some form of artistic creation. Poetry, metalwork, wood carving, textile design. These weren't specialized skills reserved for professional artists, but basic cultural competencies that every person was expected to develop. This created an artistic culture of unprecedented vitality and innovation. Without the restrictions of religious orthodoxy or imperial patronage, Viking artists were free to experiment with any style, technique, or subject matter that captured their imagination. They developed artistic techniques for working with materials that Mediterranean artists had never encountered: walrus ivory, amber, exotic furs, and feathers acquired through their vast trading networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. But perhaps most importantly, Viking art served a completely different function than Christian or classical art. It wasn't designed to inspire worship or demonstrate political power. It was created to tell stories, preserve memories, and maintain connections between the living world and the realm of gods and ancestors. Every piece of Viking art was essentially a magical object designed to channel spiritual power and preserve cultural memory. The elaborate ship burials weren't just funerals. They were artistic installations that would continue telling stories and maintaining spiritual connections long after their creators had died. When archaeologists opened the Oseberg ship burial in 1904, they found an artistic treasure trove that had been sealed for over 1,100 years. The ship itself was covered in wood carvings so intricate that they seemed to writhe and move in changing light. Every object, from kitchen utensils to ceremonial weapons, was decorated with patterns that told interconnected stories about gods, heroes, and cosmic battles. But the most remarkable discovery was a series of textile fragments that revealed Viking women had developed weaving and embroidery techniques that were centuries ahead of anything being produced in the rest of Europe. These textiles combined silk threads imported from China with local wool dyed using secret color formulations that created hues so vivid they seem modern even today. The artistic sophistication revealed in these burials forced historians to completely reconsider their understanding of Viking culture. These weren't primitive barbarians. They were members of a sophisticated artistic civilization that had developed parallel to, and in many ways surpassed, the more famous artistic traditions of Southern Europe. But while Vikings were revolutionizing Northern European art and Byzantines were developing their luminous mosaics, the most profound artistic revolution of the medieval period was happening in a place most Europeans had never heard of: the rapidly expanding Islamic world. In 749 AD, the Abbasid dynasty established their capital in Baghdad and set out to create the most magnificent city the world had ever seen. But they faced an unprecedented artistic challenge. How do you create visual splendor for a religion that prohibits the representation of living beings? The solution they developed would transform art forever. Islamic artists invented abstraction, not as a modern artistic movement, but as a spiritual necessity. Unable to paint people or animals, they turned their creative energy toward exploring pure pattern, color, and geometric form in ways that no previous culture had imagined. Let me take you inside the House of Wisdom in 9th century Baghdad, where the greatest minds of the Islamic world gathered to translate and preserve the knowledge of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese civilizations. But this wasn't just a library. It was an artistic laboratory where scholars and artists worked together to develop new forms of visual expression. Master Ibn Sina wasn't just a philosopher and physician. He was also developing mathematical theories about how geometric patterns could induce specific psychological states in viewers. Working with court artists, he created decorative schemes that used precise, mathematical relationships to create feelings of transcendence and spiritual elevation. But the real breakthrough came when Islamic artists discovered how to make geometry ecstatic. Traditional geometric patterns were static, orderly, calming. Islamic artists learned to create patterns that seemed to pulse, flow, and expand infinitely beyond the boundaries of any physical surface. They developed techniques for creating visual rhythms that match the rhythms of breathing, heartbeat, and meditative consciousness. The result was Islamic decorative art that functioned as a form of visual music. Patterns so complex and mathematically precise that viewing them became a form of meditation that could induce profound altered states of consciousness. But Islamic artists didn't stop with abstract decoration. They revolutionized architecture, creating spaces that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between interior and exterior, earth and heaven, finite and infinite. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, begun in 785 AD, demonstrates architectural techniques that seem to defy physics. A forest of horseshoe arches creates the illusion of infinite space within a finite building. Light filtered through intricate geometric screens creates constantly changing patterns that make the architecture seem alive and responsive. Most remarkably, Islamic artists developed the concept of architectural calligraphy, using Arabic script as a structural element that made buildings themselves into three-dimensional books. The walls became pages covered with Quranic verses rendered in scripts, so beautiful that the very act of reading became an aesthetic experience. This integration of text and visual design created artworks that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: as decoration, as spiritual instruction, as architectural element, and as pure aesthetic experience. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Islamic art was its mathematical sophistication. Islamic artists and mathematicians worked together to develop geometric principles that wouldn't be formally understood in European mathematics for centuries. They created patterns based on complex algebraic equations, used crystallographic principles to design tile work, and developed projection techniques that allowed them to cover curved surfaces with perfectly regular geometric patterns. Modern computer graphics artists studying Islamic geometric patterns have discovered mathematical relationships and design principles that are still being explored by cutting-edge digital artists today. But hidden within the masculine world of medieval courts and monasteries, a secret network of women was preserving and transmitting artistic knowledge that would prove crucial to Europe's eventual Renaissance. These weren't just the nuns we discussed earlier, but a much broader community of women who operated in the shadows of official art history, maintaining traditions that would have otherwise been lost forever. Let me tell you about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who in the 12th century created what may have been Europe's first artistic salon. As Queen of both France and England, Eleanor had access to artistic treasures from across the known world. But instead of simply collecting art, she created a community of female artists, poets, and craftspeople who worked together to develop new forms of artistic expression. Eleanor's court became a laboratory for artistic experimentation that was completely different from the male-dominated workshops and scriptoriums of her time. Women artists were encouraged to develop personal artistic voices rather than simply copying established traditions. They were given access to the finest materials and unlimited time to perfect their techniques. Most importantly, Eleanor's female artists were free from the religious and political restrictions that constrained male artists. They could explore secular themes, develop naturalistic representation techniques, and experiment with artistic approaches that would have been considered heretical if created by male artists working under church patronage. The artistic innovations that emerged from Eleanor's court would eventually influence everything from Gothic cathedral design to Renaissance painting techniques. But at the time, these contributions were largely invisible to the male-dominated art establishment. Similar female artistic communities operated throughout medieval Europe, often centered around noble courts or wealthy convents. These women developed their own systems for training artists, their own aesthetic theories, and their own networks for sharing artistic knowledge and techniques. But perhaps most importantly, these women served as the guardians of classical artistic knowledge during Europe's darkest periods. When male artistic institutions were destroyed by war, plague, or political upheaval, the female communities provided continuity that preserved essential techniques and knowledge for future generations. Queen Matilda of England created the Bayeux Tapestry, which isn't just a historical record but a masterpiece of narrative art that influenced storytelling, techniques, and visual art for centuries. The tapestry demonstrates sophisticated understanding of visual narrative, character development, and dramatic pacing that wouldn't be seen again until the development of cinema. But the Bayeux Tapestry was created by a team of female embroiderers working under Matilda's direction. These women developed textile techniques that were so advanced they couldn't be fully replicated until the invention of modern machinery. The tapestry also demonstrates that medieval women had access to and understanding of classical artistic principles that were supposedly lost during the Dark Ages. The composition techniques, proportional relationships, and narrative strategies used in the tapestry show clear knowledge of Roman and Greek artistic traditions. This suggests that the loss of classical knowledge during the medieval period was largely a masculine phenomenon. While male institutions struggled to preserve classical learning, female communities may have maintained unbroken connections to ancient artistic wisdom through secret networks of transmission that historians are only beginning to understand. Now let me reveal one of the most shocking artistic scandals of the medieval period: how the Crusades became the largest art theft operation in human history, and how this systematic looting actually accelerated artistic development in ways no one could have predicted. When the Fourth Crusade captured Constantinople in 1204, the Crusaders didn't just loot gold and silver. They systematically stripped the Byzantine Empire of its artistic treasures with an efficiency that would have impressed modern museum thieves. But this wasn't random vandalism. The Crusaders had developed sophisticated systems for identifying, evaluating, and transporting artistic treasures back to Western Europe. They brought along artists and scholars who could distinguish between truly valuable artworks and mere decorations. The scale of this operation was unprecedented. Entire churches were stripped of their mosaics, frescoes, and sculptural decorations. Illuminated manuscripts were stolen by the cartload. Precious metalwork, ivory carvings, and textile masterpieces were systematically catalogued and shipped to Venice, Paris, and other Western European centers. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Instead of simply hoarding these stolen treasures, Western European artists began studying them intensively, reverse engineering Byzantine techniques that had been closely guarded secrets for centuries. The influx of Byzantine artworks into Western Europe triggered an artistic renaissance that transformed European art decades before what we traditionally call the Renaissance began. Artists who had never seen sophisticated mosaic work suddenly had access to masterpieces they could study and copy. Painters who had worked only with limited color palettes gained access to Byzantine pigment formulations and techniques. But the most revolutionary impact was psychological. Western European artists, who had accepted the artistic limitations of their traditions, suddenly saw what was possible when those limitations were removed. Byzantine art demonstrated technical mastery and artistic vision that European artists had thought were impossible to achieve. This exposure to superior artistic traditions created a crisis of confidence that ultimately proved beneficial. Western artists abandoned their provincial techniques and began developing new approaches that synthesized Byzantine mastery with their own cultural perspectives. The Gothic Cathedral Revolution, which transformed European architecture in the 13th century, was directly inspired by architectural techniques that Crusaders observed and documented during their campaigns in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. But the Crusades also facilitated artistic exchange in the opposite direction. European artists traveling with Crusader armies brought Western techniques and perspectives to the Eastern Mediterranean, creating artistic fusions that influenced Islamic and Byzantine art for centuries. Most remarkably, The Crusades created the first truly international artistic community in human history. Artists from dozens of different cultural backgrounds found themselves working together on Crusader construction projects, sharing techniques and perspectives that had been developed in complete isolation from each other. The Crusader castles built in the Holy Land represent unprecedented artistic collaborations between Western European stonemasons, Byzantine architects, Islamic decorative artists, and local craftspeople. These buildings synthesized artistic traditions from across the known world in ways that created entirely new architectural vocabularies. But the most mysterious artistic legacy of the Crusades involves the Knights Templar, whose secret artistic projects may have preserved and transmitted knowledge that would prove crucial to Europe's artistic rebirth. The Templars weren't just warrior monks. They were sophisticated collectors and commissioners of art who operated according to aesthetic principles that remain mysterious even today. Their churches, castles, and other buildings demonstrate architectural knowledge that seems to have come from sources that historians haven't identified. Templar architecture incorporates precise mathematical relationships that create specific acoustic and optical effects. Their buildings are oriented according to astronomical alignments that suggest deep knowledge of celestial mechanics. Most mysteriously, their decorative schemes include symbolic elements that appear to synthesize Christian, Islamic, and pre-Christian spiritual traditions. But the Templars' most significant artistic contribution may have been their role in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Archaeological evidence suggests that Templar libraries contained Greek and Roman texts on artistic technique, mathematical proportion, and architectural engineering that didn't officially survive the fall of the Roman Empire. When the Templars were suppressed in 1307, their artistic knowledge didn't disappear. It went underground, preserved by secret networks that would eventually resurface during the Renaissance. Many of the new techniques that Renaissance artists claim to have discovered were actually rediscoveries of classical knowledge that had been preserved through Templar and other secret traditions during the medieval period. As we reach the end of our journey through the transformation of art from pagan to Christian, from imperial to anonymous, from classical to medieval, I want you to understand the profound miracle we've witnessed. We've watched art die and be reborn. We've seen techniques lost and rediscovered. We've witnessed the human creative spirit survive the collapse of empires, the devastation of plagues, the destruction of entire civilizations, and emerge stronger, more diverse, and more innovative than ever before. The anonymous artists of the medieval period achieved something that no previous generation had accomplished. They democratized creativity. Instead of art being the privilege of imperial courts or wealthy elites, medieval artists proved that the most profound artistic vision could emerge from monastery cells, convent scriptoriums, and village workshops. They showed that artistic mastery didn't require individual genius or official recognition. It required only dedication to the craft, openness to spiritual inspiration, and the courage to create beauty in the face of chaos and uncertainty. But most importantly, they preserved the essential flame of human creativity through Europe's darkest centuries and passed it on to the Renaissance masters who would build upon their achievements to create the artistic traditions that shape our world today. Every illuminated manuscript, every Gothic cathedral, Every piece of medieval metalwork was a victory over despair, a declaration that beauty matters more than survival, that humans will continue to create, even when creation seems impossible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you carry the legacy of these anonymous masters. Their courage lives in every creative choice you make. Their vision inspires every moment of beauty you create or recognize. Their dedication to craft echoes in every careful effort you make to do something well, rather than merely adequately. The medieval period wasn't the Dark Ages for art. It was the transformational ages, when art learned to serve not just power and wealth, but spirit and soul. When creativity became a form of prayer and making became a form of loving. In our next episode, we'll witness the explosive rebirth of art as Europe awakens from its medieval transformation. We'll see how the seeds planted by anonymous medieval masters will blossom into the greatest artistic flowering in human history. The Renaissance, where art becomes the language of humanism, and where individual artistic genius is celebrated as a form of divine gift. Until then, sleep in the knowledge that you are part of humanity's greatest ongoing masterpiece, the eternal conversation between human consciousness and the materials of creation that began in Ice Age caves and continues in your heart today.